In Chapter 11, we're discussing relationships with family members, and in this chapter, I think we'll see, as we have in others, and maybe even more so, how the interpersonal communication choices that we make and that others make influence the relationship outcomes that follow. We're going to start with a broad understanding of relationships, family relationships, I should say, by defining family very broadly. So when we talk about family, we're talking about a network of people. And that network of people share their lives over long periods of time. They're bound by marriage, blood, or some other type of commitment. They consider themselves as family, so perception is important. And they share a significant history and anticipated future, which means that they've been through some things together and they intend to be in it for the long haul. So this helps us to understand how family members see themselves as part of a family. It can also help to look at some of the additional characteristics of a family, such as the strong sense of family identity that is in many ways developed and nurtured through communication. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But secondly here, families also use communication to define boundaries. So they use communication to say what information or what individuals are allowed inside of the family. So what kind of outside information or what outsiders can join the family, and also what kind of information can leave the family, for example. Thirdly, families share an intense and complex emotional set of bonds. You may have read already McCormick's idea that at the same time you can have both warm and antagonistic feelings toward your family, sometimes toward the same family member even. But it is complex, certainly. Fourth, families share a history. Fifth, they may or may not share genetic material. And sixth, they juggle multiple, sometimes competing roles. So you may have experienced that already as an individual within a family, feeling like you're pulled by being, a parent, a sibling, and maybe a caregiver to an older family member. If it's been more simple than that for you thus far, then it may grow more complex in the future as your roles evolve and change. So these are some of the defining characteristics of a family. Now that we understand broadly what a family is, let's briefly look at McCormick's long list here of different types of families. We used to think of the traditional family as the nuclear family, the first listed here, but it certainly is not. It's not necessarily the norm, and the list of types of families here demonstrates that. There are extended families which are growing in commonality in American culture. Step families certainly are quite common. Cohabiting couples, single parent families, and voluntary kin families are all types of family that are equally valid. And it really is, again, about sharing the components that define family more than it is about sharing blood, though that certainly can be part of your family. The interesting parts about communication that we have to get into here are multiple. First, family stories really rely upon family communication. Stories are narrative accounts shared repeatedly within a family. They retell historical events and they bond the family together. They can teach important lessons. They can teach important values. 3 examples of family stories that McCormick discusses are courtship, birth and entrance stories, and survival stories. So these types of stories are important for families. They tell about significant events. They help bond the family together. We often first think of family stories as positive. They may also be negative. So family stories can certainly be a positive survival story. Imagine having a grandparent who survived the Holocaust. And that survival story would leave your family with a strong sense of identity. But we would think of that as a positive story, a survival story, and yet we may also share negative stories, stories about something terrible that happened. And as in the case of a Holocaust survivor, you might see that a family story has both positive and negative elements. So they're not strictly positive. Sometimes family stories have positive and negative elements, and sometimes they are just negative. They tell a story about something bad that happened. It might be a turning point in the family where the family uses that story to say what it's not anymore. So family stories, again, they increase that sense of identity, and they're really complicated. They rely upon communication, of course, in order to enhance that sense of family identity. In addition, families also use communication in different ways. So we use communication for different purposes, and each of our family uses communication in different ways. Typically, we can find where our family lies in this. Well, I shouldn't say lies. We can find our family's communication pattern by looking at where our family lies on a couple of dimensions. So family communication patterns determine how families converse. And certainly within your family, depending upon with whom you're conversing, the pattern may be different. But if you think of your immediate family, for our purposes here, as we're going through this information, I think it might be helpful for you, particularly for the Chapter 11 discussion, as we start talking about family communication patterns. Our textbook talks about family communication patterns as a theory that has developed, I think, in the last couple of decades, and it says that there are two dimensions that underlie communication between family members. Those two dimensions are 1, conversation orientation, and 2, conformity orientation. So when we figure out where our families are on these dimensions, then we can determine our family's communication pattern. So let's start with the first of the two dimensions, the conversation orientation. This is the degree to which family members are encouraged to discuss a variety of topics. So families that are high in conversation and that discuss a broad range of topics would be said to have a high degree of conversation, or to be high on the spectrum of conversation orientation. Families that converse very infrequently and whose range of topics is very limited would demonstrate a low degree of conversation. So they would be on the lower end of the conversation orientation dimension. So now that we've talked about what that dimension looks like and we understand the conversation orientation, we can talk about conformity orientation. Conformity orientation is the degree to which families believe that communication should emphasize similarity or diversity. So think of this again as a spectrum. On one end you have consensus, and on the other end you have complete freedom of thought. When your family converses, does your family communicate in order to come to a consensus, in order to arrive at a similar position? Oftentimes it's the family members who hold the most power, who determine what that position is that everyone should agree upon. Or conversely, on the other end of the spectrum, does your family communicate in order to enable or allow for complete freedom of thought, diversity of ideas? Where your family falls on this spectrum is going to determine your conformity orientation. Do you tend to have a high degree of conformity consensus at the end of your communication events? Or is there, again, kind of unrestrained freedom of thought, diversity of ideas in your family's conversations? Nobody has to agree at the end of the conversation, would be kind of one pole, one end of the spectrum, while conformity and consensus is at the other end. So now that we know what the two orientations are, let's talk about what they mean in terms of family communication patterns, because it's these two dimensions that underlie our family's communication pattern. There are 4 types. McCormick says that most families are going to fall into one of these 4 types, though again, depending on with whom you're conversing at any given time within your family, there certainly can be some variation. Consensual families are high in conversation. So in that conversation dimension, these families communicate frequently and about a wide variety of topics. However, these families are also high in conformity, which means that at the end of the conversation, consensus is expected. So these families converse frequently about a broad variety of topics, and it's important for these families that there's a consensus or an agreement at the end of the conversation about the values or the lessons learned or whatever it is. Second, pluralistic families are also high in conversation. They talk a lot and about a broad variety of topics. These families, however, are low in consensus. So their conformity orientation would be described as the opposite of consensual families. Unlike consensual families, pluralistic families allow for freedom of thought, and consensus is not necessarily the end goal of a conversation. So both consensual and pluralistic families have high conversation, but they differ in terms of the conformity orientation. Third, we have protective families. Protective families, interestingly, are low in conversation. They don't talk much, they don't talk about a lot, but they are high in terms of conformity. The expectation is that though these families don't talk a whole lot, they don't talk about a whole lot, there's a lot of constraint in terms of the communication, everyone is still expected to say that they agree about everything. Often there's a lot of power wielded, typically by parents in these families. Conversation is, again, not frequent, and it's not all that varied, but consensus is expected. Fourth, the laissez-faire family type is low in both conversation and conformity. So the laissez-faire family doesn't talk much. They don't talk about a wide variety of topic, and these family members don't have to agree. Consensus is not emphasized. So it's kind of what you might think of as a free-for-all, as the term laissez-faire suggests. Here are the 4 family communication patterns. It's important that you understand them for our discussion, as you'll be identifying your own family's communication pattern, but it's also important that you understand them for your own edification, and maybe even to share some of this with your family members might be really interesting and educational for them too. We've talked about the family communication patterns. We're going to talk just briefly here at the very end of our discussion about maintaining family relationships and some of the complexity of family relationship maintenance. Like romantic relationships, families also have to be maintained. We sometimes don't think about family relationship maintenance because we think family relationships are kind of a given, but the reality is that they have to be maintained. And so, just like in romantic relationships, we can use communication to practice maintenance strategies for families. Things like positivity and assurances, which are really important in the romantic relationships that we discussed in Chapter 10, are also important for maintaining family relationships. And just like in romantic relationships that we talked about in Chapter 10, we experience relationship tensions, relational dialectics. We also experience some of those same relational dialectics with our family members. So some of the strategies we talked about in Chapter 10 apply here. Some additional information about family communication that warrants mentioning because it's so important is what happens when families communicate in negative, abusive ways, or when there's a lot of conflict in families. And this requires us probably to think about our family of origin and our own families and how the communication that we witnessed between parents in the household in which we grew up continues to impact the ways that we communicate and the relationships that we have now. So families that have high interparental conflict tend to produce children who have some real challenges in future relationships. The good news is that there is help. There are professionals who are able to counsel us through some of these things, but it's important to remember that if there was a lot of interparental conflict in your family, as a child you're not at fault, and yet the spillover hypothesis says that you were probably impacted by it, and that it will probably continue to impact the relationships that you have in your future. And so this can really bring us back to that important point, which is that the communication choices we make influence the relationship outcomes that follow. The communication choices your parents made influenced the relationships that they had with their children. And if you happen to be a parent or maybe a parent in the future, then that'll be important for you to think about as well. You can read more about it in your text, and you can shoot me an email about what you learn about interparental conflict and how it influences you for a little extra credit. Thanks for listening, and hopefully